Welcome to KnowledgeCast. This is a look into the world of knowledge management, information management, data management, and everything in between. This is brought to you by Enterprise Knowledge. I'm Zach Wahl, founder and CEO of EK, and today we're speaking with TJ Hsu, Director of R&D Knowledge Management at Amgen. TJ, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, thrilled. We've known each other for years, have had some great conversations, so looking forward to another one with you. TJ, you've listened to the show before. One of your colleagues has been on. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, how do you define knowledge management?
Yeah, so my definition is pretty simple. It's about connecting people to the knowledge they need to be at their best. Now, it's a simple phrase, but there's a lot of complexity behind it, right? So as we know, there are 100 different ways to do knowledge management, which I think is one of the reasons why everyone has their own definition of knowledge management. But when you think about connecting people, right, we've gone from back in the earlier days, browsing through databases. When I started, I was browsing through Lotus Notes databases. We graduated to, enterprise social networks. Now we're getting to ask and converse, right? I think that's heading towards more do, right? So it's like browse, search, ask. I think the next phase is do as the new technologies enable us to do work in new and effective ways. When you think about connecting knowledge, right? Now, knowledge comes in so many different forms. When you think about like documents and sites, then that became, and as the technology has and the approaches have advanced, we've seen more and more about expertise, automating, inferring expertise, and connecting experts to each other, and getting into things like tacit knowledge. And the last part is, right, to help people be at their best. That's about productivity, it's about decision-making, it's about employee engagement, it's about innovation. In my context, we're usually talking about workers within an organization. And I think the core idea with knowledge management is that we want to go from a collection of intelligent individuals to collective or organizational intelligence, right? Both at the kind of individual tactical level, but also at the corporate strategic level, that as a whole, the organization is learning, right? That we're collectively learning, that we're not repeating the same mistakes, that we're getting smarter over time, and that we're making better decisions. So it's sort of the idea from one of my prior companies that we used to say, we is greater than me, that we collectively are smarter than any one individual could be by themselves. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about knowledge management, right? Connecting people to the knowledge they need to be at their best. And the complexity, the interesting things come from all the different ways you can do that.
I love that. So the connecting people to the knowledge they need, pretty classic, but they're at their best, I think, is a really nice spin on this. And it's the sort of thing that gets me asking the question of how do you figure out what that is? Because even if you take an organization like Amgen, not everybody needs the same things to be at their best. Some need rapid upscaling, some need access to experts, some just need to be told how to do something in the most efficient or effective or safest way possible. So in an organization that's so complex, that's so big, how do you define that at their best at a way that becomes actionable?
Yeah, so at Amgen, and a lot of companies do this, but one of the keys, sort of our secret sauce, is deep appreciation for the role. So my knowledge management function is part of a broader knowledge learning function, and this program, in this case, my role is not enterprise-wide. It's specific to our research, development, and medical affairs functions. And so a part of that is deeply understanding the roles within those organizations. And it's not about, in this case, serving every role, right? We have limited resources. We have a very small knowledge management team. It's about prioritizing what are the most important, impactful roles, and then deeply understanding what they do, right, using things like human-centered design thinking, so that when we develop knowledge solutions, they feel the impact, they feel the difference, right? And so that could be learning and onboarding. It could be things like compliance learning. It could be things like how they need to do their job differently as we constantly innovate and try and transform the way we work, right? So I think be at the best at the individual, that's what that means. I think then as well, sort of that's the bottom up, from the top down, right? From a corporate strategic level, is about targeting what we do for knowledge and learning at the highest priority initiatives within the company, the things that leadership cares about the most, right? So that leadership feels like, okay, knowledge is enabling the things that, you know, is at the top of my agenda, what we call our prioritized agenda. It's the things that keep me up at night. And at the individual level, those linchpin key roles are getting the knowledge they need, ideally like in the flow of their work. The old adage, the right knowledge to the right people at the right time. So it's not trying to solve for everyone, but trying to be really targeted in what we're doing, both at a leadership level and an individual level. And then, besides that deep appreciation for the role, we combine that with the curation of the most critical knowledge within the functions and thoughtful application of and partnership with technology.
Great. So you've hit on a couple of things there that I think are really fantastic. And I want to just summarize. One is the idea of really understanding who your end users are, whether you want to do classic user personas or not. What you're effectively doing is saying, look, we can't do everything for everybody, but you're taking your core users and then you're understanding their needs, their goals, and you're solving for the things that, pardon the phrase, will give you the greatest bang for the buck, right? But the leadership piece, I think it's something that a lot of organizations miss, a lot of KM professionals miss. The idea that every organization has a set of corporate goals for the year or 5-year strategy plan or CEO's to-do list. And so many organizations fail to map KM to that list. And it sounds like that's something that you've really understood and tried to adopt. So tell me a little bit more about that. How does what KM does, what you do at Amgen, map to Amgen's top priorities and top goals?
Yeah. And I definitely can't take all the credit for this. I've only been at Amgen about 10 months. And my leader, Brian Yee, who, by the way, one of the best leaders I've worked for, and I'm not just saying that to brown nose, I genuinely believe that, yeah.
And genuinely such a good guy and former guest here on Knowledge Cast. Brian's awesome. We love Brian.
Yeah, exactly. And he was actually the knowledge management director before he got elevated to lead knowledge and learning, which is a combination of internal knowledge, right? Knowledge management, external knowledge, which is our corporate library, which we've aligned and brought together, and functional learning. And so the approach that, because the program started about 5 years ago, Brian hasn't been doing knowledge management for 25 years like you and I have, right? But what he has been doing is he's been at Amgen, right, for a long time. And he's built up so much credibility and relationships with the business and leadership. And so he understands the company really well, right? I can't understand the company as well as he can within 10 months, but really understanding what's going to matter most for business leadership. And like you said, I think this is where knowledge management often goes wrong, right? I've been at many companies and, I've been guilty of this myself, having led some of these programs where knowledge management is focused on, okay, let's build like an enterprise search or an enterprise knowledge repository that can benefit everyone in the organization because everyone in the company has knowledge to share. They've got insights. They're learning things. And if all of us can benefit from the intelligence of, the entire organization, we will all get smarter and better. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I believe that, right? I've built systems like that. But the problem is when leadership sees that, they think, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That sounds really, really interesting. That sounds like it could really matter. But it's not tangible or relevant for them, right? They're like, okay, well, that's a collective thing. Is that the thing I care about most, helping everyone else get better? Or do I care about like my business unit, my function, my revenue, profit, target, whatever those goals might be? And so, what we've done here at Amgen is to say, okay, let's look at that prioritized agenda, right? The upper right quadrant when you look at like value and complexity or whatever strategic framework you use. The most important things, right? If leaders are saying, this initiative X, the thing I care about most, knowledge management has helped enable this, helped this to be successful, then knowledge is truly relevant. So that's where the whole prioritization comes in, right? You don't have to build massive enterprise systems to do that. It doesn't have to be like the most complex thing and most innovative thing knowledge management has ever done. It's about being relevant to what they care about. And so that's kind of been, a bit of a different approach than a lot of other places I've been and has made it really, really impactful, really relevant.
I think that's right. I mean, the word that you used was enabling. The word I often use is foundational. Look, the reality is that most CEOs are never going to have knowledge management as one of the driving goals for the organization. But our role as KM practitioners is to show them how whatever they do have up there can be enabled or can have KM as a foundational component of it. How do we make it easier? How do we make it better? How do we remove the risk from whatever their goals are? Obviously, artificial intelligence is one of the things on most CEOs' lists right now. And I know you well enough to know that we fundamentally believe that KM is a huge enabler for AI. We're going to get to that. But first, I want to hit on something else that you said. You've been at the organization 10 months at this point.
Yeah.
And I think that that's such a critical period. And you came into a KM program that was already in flight. So tell me about your 10 months. How did you learn the organization? How did you get smart? How did you decide what you wanted to maintain and what you wanted to change?
Yeah. And sorry, I'm going to go back to that previous point about targeting what's most relevant for the business. One other thing that I would add is that it's not about solving one problem over here because it's important to leaders and then going solving a different problem over here and then repeating over and over and solving these problems. The idea is that not only do you solve the problem, but you do it in a way you partner with like enterprise functions like technology or HR or legal and compliance to solve a problem, but using an enterprise pattern, right? So you solve it in a way that can scale to the enterprise. Because I think solving for the enterprise is the ultimate goal. We don't all want to be solving for our particular function and creating siloed solutions. We want to solve for the enterprise. So but you can't get there unless you're relevant to the business. So solve something relevant to the business, but do in a way where you're creating a pattern that can scale to the enterprise.
Yeah, well said. That's a great ad. It really is. It's the idea of using pilots, prototypes, really deliberate solutions that can then scale to the enterprise, to the entire company, right?
Yeah. So anyway, back to the question, right? So that was just a thought that popped up. But anyway,
it's great.
So, for the first 10 months at Amgen, I think everyone does it different. And I've, read books like, your first 100 days or whatever, what are the most critical things to do? My approach was just to come in and just start listening, right? Try to understand and learn. Listen to my team, talk to a bunch of different stakeholders, get a sense of first, let me understand what's in place today. What capabilities do we have today? What's gone well? Which there's a lot of things that have gone well. I have an amazing knowledge management team that was already in place before I joined. People who are just really competent and good at what they do, who have built these particular capabilities. Understanding the approach that was taken here and the way that we've aligned our capabilities against the business relevant priorities. So a lot of it was just starting by listening and learning. I think Brian has done a great job at helping point knowledge management, target it at the things that will make a difference. And so part of it was also trying to get a quick win under my belt, right? To establish credibility. So you can establish credibility in a couple of ways. One is by, just reaching out and talking to people, showing some passion, showing some energy, an attitude and openness to collaborate. My personal style is sort of like a trust, empathy approach, right? Get to know people, right? Get to know the people that you're going to be working with. Start to share your ideas, your energy to kind of help them be open, right? Establish your credentials and then do something that will give you a win earlier on. For us, that was pointing our knowledge capabilities at a EU compliance law that Amgen has to be compliant, right? So a relatively new law. And the typical approach within, pharma, a highly regulated industry is, okay, there's something we have to be compliant with. If we're not compliant, that has massive consequences. So let's write a policy or standard operating procedure in almost like semi-legalese, very technical language. Let's assign it to everyone in LMS so that when they take it and certify that they've read and understood it and we get audited, we can show the auditors, hey, we are compliant. Here's the records. Everyone in the company knows this new policy or SOP. And then we, pharma companies will flood people with like all these things. You join and you spend the first couple of weeks reading a bunch of technical policies and SOPs. You don't remember retain any of it. Right. You retain like 5% of it, 10% of it, especially when it may not be, it might be 6 months later before you actually have to remember and apply that knowledge by the time you've completely forgotten it. And you've forgotten that there's a policy or SOP in it, even if you knew it was there, like you're not going to go track it down and reread it, right? So the idea was to transform from that to orchestrate better learning experiences that kind of span, again, right knowledge to the right people at the right time. When is it most relevant for me to know this in my role based on an upcoming clinical trial milestone or whatever it is, and deliver that in the flow of work? So that's what we did with this, is called the in vitro diagnostic regulation, this EU regulation. So that was kind of establishing some early credibility. The other thing was then very quickly positioning knowledge management as a key partner and enabler of, things that are important, right? And AI is one of those things, right? Establishing the role of knowledge management in enabling AI, generative AI. Amgen is the world's largest independent biotech, highly innovative, kind of had a startup mentality. It's maturing, right, and having to evolve. But Amgen is fully embracing the AI wave and really kind of going on the AI. So how can we position, right, we talked about the importance of knowledge management in enabling AI, really position knowledge management as leveraging my past expertise working with AI and positioning it as a key enabler for artificial intelligence, articulating the strategy for knowledge management, which at Amgen is kind of three things. One is establishing that knowledge foundation through that curation of what is most important to the business. And that's so key, right? And it's like the whole garbage in, garbage out, right? If you don't have good knowledge, you don't get great outputs, right? If your knowledge base for AI is like everything you have access to in the Microsoft ecosystem, that's not that's not good for a whole host of reasons. Yeah. The second piece was around then how do we contextualize all that? So it's something we call the web of knowledge or the connected web of knowledge, where the idea is like, we have things like our products, our drugs, and we have clinical trials associated to those drugs. And then we've got people associated who are on product teams or clinical trial teams. So if you take our drugs, our studies, and our people, those are like the core objects to what we do as a pharma company. And every function has their own view of those things. They have their own systems with information about those things that's like kind of in their lens, usually locked down, right? And so can we start to connect and contextualize knowledge from all these different functions around those core objects and then create intuitive digital experiences that allow people to navigate that information without having to know all like the hacks of like, oh, to get this piece of information, I have to go over here, request access to this system, log in there, click on this, click on that, and then I can get it. Most people don't do that. Let's contextualize it through this web of knowledge. And so once we have that knowledge foundation, we contextualize it, that can then truly power transformative AI solutions. So then, back to your question, right? The question was like, how did I start at Amgen? What did I do? Right? It was all those things: listening, understanding the direction, establishing credibility early on, and then starting to, articulate a vision of how we're going to move forward, and then start to, do the work.
You've had a busy 10 months. So I have several questions that I want to go back to. First of all, I loved your quick win, the idea of embedding knowledge in the flow of work or knowledge at the point of need. How'd you do that? What did that, I feel like there's so many ways that could have been done. I'm picturing Clippy popping up in the corner, and it seems like, Clippy saying, hey, it seems like you're trying to learn about in vitro diagnostic regulation. Like, how did you actually create that knowledge being delivered in the flow of work?
Yeah. So going back to what I said earlier, right? Solving particular problems for the business, but in the process, you build a capability, right? So it's not like, okay, let's start with an enterprise search engine and then go find out where it's going to make an impact. It's like, let's start in this problem and create some, in this case, they're not like rocket science capabilities. So there were some capabilities around curating knowledge through lessons learned in the form of these narrative stories, right? The idea is that, instead of just like little chunked up insights, let's tell a story about what someone learned about IVDR, right? Some of the early studies that went through the process, what were the things that they learned and who are the experts who worked on that so you can connect them easily. We curated the knowledge and the insights into things we call knowledge centers, right? Just, straightforward topical pages that everything you need to know, the most important things, right? And then we put generative AI on top of it. We use, in this case, we work with a couple of different technologies, but we used Copilot Studio to create a customized sort of chatbot on just the curated high quality knowledge that we maintain and keep up to date. So now people can start to converse and ask questions about IVDR. And then the next step is to do that sort of targeted delivery that says, okay, if a clinical trial is flagged as, IVDR impacted, and you're coming up to the point where you're starting to engage vendors, right? Okay, what are the key roles who are part of that process? And let's make sure, that we're pushing the insights and knowledge to them so that they realize that they need to make sure that they're aware of IVDR so they don't get to a point where all of a sudden you've got 70 labs doing work for clinical trial. And then you realize after the fact, oh, shoot, what about this big IVDR regulation? They're not IVDR compliant, or we haven't figured out an approach with them, right? So it's getting in front of that.
Excellent.
It was actually a lot of the capabilities were there. And so it's just about applying those same capabilities that we've had.
So first of all, that is a good mid-tech approach, but it was a knowledge-first approach, right? You started with the storytelling, with capturing really good, clean content that would be then actionable and be able to be deployed in the right places. So yeah, I love that story.
Yeah. And in that case, we went from many hours of LMS training to like a really short, streamlined, this is like just the key points you need to know about IVDR, and then all the knowledge components around it. So it was sort of a learning, training plus knowledge approach rather than the more traditional training heavy forward approach.
Yeah, and you mentioned L&D and training several times. My own hypothesis on this is over the next 5 years, that's going to be a corporate function that goes through about as big of change as could possibly happen. That finally the idea of learning at the point of need is going to be a reality, that it's going to be embedded throughout processes day to day. And so much of that training that happens at the beginning of one's onboarding will actually kind of melt away. Thoughts on that? It seems like you're already heading in that direction pretty significantly at Amgen.
Yeah. I mean, one of the core kind of big picture goals of the knowledge and learning function is to transform the way we learn, transform the way Amgen people learn. And it's already happening, right? I think, especially with AI, there's so much potential for changing the way the world learns with AI. I just listened to this really awesome podcast, Microsoft podcast with Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy. And he was talking about how the gold standard of education has been known for thousands of years. It was back with like Alexander the Great, who had a personal tutor in the form of Aristotle, right?
Not bad.
Not bad, right? Aristotle, who was trained by Plato, who was trained by Socrates, right? And that was only for the very privileged few, the most elite of the elite. Then a couple hundred years ago, the idea of mass education came around to try to democratize that and give everyone access to high quality education. And that's had huge benefits. But, there's lots of problems with that system as well, right? There's still so much inequality in education. And so I think AI has such potential to transform that, to truly democratize not just classroom education, but give everyone that gold standard that each of us can have our own Aristotle that's personalized to us. When you need to go fast, it can go fast. When you need to go slow, it can go slow. It's personalized to to who you are. And it opens up so much potential in terms of like learning in different modalities, right? And things like, what if you could talk to Aristotle? Or, let's say you're reading The Lord of the Rings at school. I wish that they would assign Lord of the Rings to school because it's one of my favorite books. But imagine being able to just talk to Tolkien or to have a conversation with Gandalf, right? The wizard. So there's so much. And so we're seeing some of that too, right? Evolve even today with ChatGPT coming out with the study mode, right? Where the criticism was, it's going to take away our critical thinking. But a lot of the so-called problems that AI creates, AI can also be the solution to those. Right? So they come out with study and learn, which uses things like Socratic dialogue and scaffolding, and just don't give the answer, help someone develop their critical thinking. Those things are evolving, and that's something that we've been doing at Amgen as well, right? So we've been looking at how people learn through things like AI-powered interactive coaching or simulated role play, interactive knowledge checks, practicing a presentation to a group of doctors, right? So And we've been doing this, we're thinking about this in the context of medical affairs, which is basically the function that engages with the medical community to explain and educate them on like the science about our drugs and our products. We've also been thinking about in terms of like clinical trial, the idea being, can we use AI not just for Q&A, but to say, okay, you're going to have an interaction with a doctor, coach them through what that conversation might look like and how to be most effective in that conversation. Or, okay, you're talking to a doctor. Let's actually simulate the conversation, have a complete back and forth in real time with video, and you're just speaking to it, multilingual, pick any language you want. And then after that, it'll assess you against predefined criteria, everything from filler words, conciseness, to the kind of language you're using. Are you following sort of the framework for how we engage doctors, scientific accuracy, all those kinds of things. And so we're sort of building this idea of sort of like digital twins, right? A digital twin of a doctor or a patient. Or, another thing would be like a digital twin of like the clinical trial manager who knows all the SOPs and the policies and knows how, we need to start doing clinical trials differently. And you can, start to have like an assistant, not just an assistant, but someone to bounce ideas off. And all that's becoming so much easier with AI. So it's so exciting. But I think part of that is making this successful. Curation is so key to all of that. The knowledge that goes into that, building that sort of brain is so key. And then the thoughtful application of that technology, right? Understanding the role, right? Curation, understanding the role, thoughtful application of technology. So there's so much here, right? with learning.
KnowledgeCast is brought to you by Enterprise Knowledge, the world's largest dedicated knowledge management consultancy. From training to benchmarks, strategy, design, prototyping, and all the way to enterprise-level implementations, Enterprise Knowledge wants to be your services partner. Spanning the fields of knowledge management, knowledge graphs, data, learning, advanced content management, and enterprise artificial intelligence, contact us at info@enterprise-knowledge.com to discuss how we can support you.
You nailed it with your role of KM in enabling generative AI, though. It is wholly dependent on having the right content to feed the intelligence and the right context, so that you can ensure that digital tutor, that partner in brainstorming is aligned with the ethics of the organization and is accurate, is teaching the right stuff. So let's talk about that. Your number one was cleaning content. I won't say this specifically about Amgen, but what we know is that most organizations are dealing with just an absolute mess of old, obsolete content, stuff that you wouldn't want any AI to teach against or advise against, right? So how have you tackled that giant beast? In a lot of organizations, it's at least 5 times too much old, obsolete, redundant, near duplicate content. And we know Gen AI does really badly with near duplicate, right? It doesn't understand what's the most recent version. So what do you do about that?
Yeah. So like you said, right, one example of that would be we have our SOPs and policies uploaded to a controlled document environment with all the versioning kept up to date. The problem is people love downloading those and then uploading those to SharePoint, which then becomes an immediately out-of-date version. So you can ask, say, Copilot a question about our policy and how much you can spend on lunch. And that information, you can't trust that because there's like 5 different versions that have been uploaded by, everyone in your network. So part of that is sort of that curation of what is most important, right? Which is a big role that knowledge management plays. And again, it's not for everything, right? But okay, let's take a particular initiative, a particular part of the business, a particular role, and say, what's the best that we have access to, whether it's internal or external, and set that apart, set that aside, so that that's what generative AI is feeding off of. And no one really, people outside of knowledge management aren't really thinking about that, right? The technology organizations, they're all leveraging these powerful new technologies and they want to work with the business to solve them. The business knows their problem and they're really interested in standing up, a prototype, a proof of concept, a POC. But technology is not the group to say, well, what about the knowledge? How do you keep that up to date? And the business is not interested in like all the processes and work that it takes to maintain and curate that knowledge. And so that's where knowledge management can come in and be that connector between technology and the business to say, okay, where's the knowledge pipeline in this? How do we keep that up to date? So I think that's where that expertise curation comes in, right? So for example, we launched an AI solution. This was right, I mentioned internal and external knowledge. So we have a corporate library. Amgen pays a lot of money to subscribe to external content resources, right? These companies provide, we pay them to give us like research literature, competitive intelligence, external landscape information. And so what we did is we took the role of the researcher who needs to do a lot of research literature, but if you can use ChatGPT, right, for that, but anyone can do that, right? That's not truly competitive advantage. The competitive advantage comes when you are leveraging your proprietary knowledge, or in this case as well, the external knowledge that we're paying and have access to. So we created a research literature analysis engine across all of our therapeutic areas, leveraging, I think, like 5 or 10 million research articles. But that doesn't work without that expertise, that curation expertise, right? This is my colleague Karen in the library. That doesn't work without understanding what are the best resources out there. It doesn't work without understanding how do we get access to these things? Who has access? How does the licensing work? It doesn't work without navigating and understanding copyright. Otherwise, that whole thing is dead in the water. So that's where, right, now the role of knowledge curation is so critical in enabling those things. It's also critical, for example, with that coaching and role play application that we built.
Yeah, so to me, there's two angles to this. One is treating your experts like a knowledge asset in and of themselves, and ensuring that part of your network, part of what your generative AI is aware of, is the fact that it can refer the user to an expert to have an actual human dialogue with, or an actual conversation. The other is treating the expert as a source of knowledge where that knowledge needs to be digitized so that it can be ingested into the knowledge base. I guess a third would be that using the expert to curate the knowledge and ensure that it is in and of itself accurate and complete. So just so our listeners understand, is it all the above for you? Are you doing all of those things, or have you prioritized one or a couple over the rest?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those. So I to read that back to you, I feel like one is connecting people to people, right? Knowing who our experts are so that you can go talk to them, which is hugely valuable and something that has been difficult to solve in knowledge management until, last 8 years, I think, is when we started to see really effective solutions there. Two is taking what they know in their head and kind of digitizing that so it's accessible. And three, using them to validate the results. And so we're working in all three in various respects, right? There's like the whole expertise inference, right? I built this system at Accenture that infers expertise of like the entire company, which is now 750,000 people, based on all their enterprise sort of digital breadcrumbs, all the clues that they have. And so we're doing some of that here, right? We call it inferred expertise. My team member Rebecca's been working on this around saying, okay, when people are working on a product or a study, we can infer certain things about that. We're starting to think about, can we infer expertise based on what they knew before they joined Amgen, or based on their publication research, right? Or their published research. So we're doing some of that. The second piece, right, kind of digitizing what's in their brain. There's that whole tacit knowledge thing, the idea of like the digital twin or the digital clone. And so we're thinking about that, right? The idea of that digital trial manager. When we were at the KM Summit in Dublin, I was talking to Stan Garfield, right? And he's like codified so much of what he knows. And like, he's like hundreds of articles. And so I created a digital Stan Garfield. So you could ask it any question and could answer from his library. And I did that like in 30 minutes on my phone. And it's amazing what he can do. And I've seen other companies, I think Scott Beard at Cummins, I believe. I might have to double check that. Right, he's using it for knowledge transfer. When you've got these people with tons of experience who might be leaving the company, right? Just having conversations, recording those conversations, and using that to build a digital version of this person so you can talk to them after they left the company. I saw an article in the Times about people who are actually doing this with loved ones with terminal conditions, right? So I can can I talk to my dad, after he passes away, right? And that gets really heavy.
We need another hour for that one. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the golden goose of KM has always been tacit knowledge capture and having the expertise live on beyond the individual. And it's all of a sudden pretty easy just based on existing technologies. So it seems like, again, Amgen has harnessed that beautifully. Let's move on to contextualize, because it sounded like when you were describing that, what I was hearing in my own brain was you're talking about ontologies, maybe some knowledge graphs. How exactly have you started contextualizing the knowledge or the relationships within your organization?
Yeah, and it's what you said. It's things like knowledge graphs and ontologies, right? Having sort of a knowledge graphs around our products or studies and people where they're all connected to each other, right? Like I mentioned before, we've got certain products. Those products can be marketed or pipelined. There's all sorts of metadata about those indications, where they've been approved in which countries. And then all those have clinical, or a lot of those have clinical trials associated with them. And those clinical trials have teams of people, everyone from a trial manager to a clinical research associate to biostatistician. There's just so many connections. You can imagine building this graph. What are all the components of a product at Amgen across all the different functions, including, and you could think about manufacturing and commercial, right? And then when you can create that knowledge graph, you can then start to connect that knowledge together and sort of traverse that knowledge and start to answer questions, right? Generative AI, like you said, it doesn't always understand the context, but when you can give it the context of what this thing is about, right? Whether it's like insights from the field at a particular trial site for one of our drugs in a particular country, then you can start to ask and answer really interesting questions like, why is this one trial site in this country, in Germany, missing its deadline when the one in Austria is hitting its? Or which site do we think which site might miss a deadline based on the sentiment we're hearing out in the field? Right? So it's kind of having that knowledge graph to give it the context to be able to answer and predict those interesting questions.
I want to punctuate for our listeners how powerful this is. I mean, what you're describing is finally connecting the entire logistics of the organization, the entire life cycle of a product, from inkling of an idea through initial research, through testing, through production, distribution, marketing, to be able to have the full intelligence, to be able to answer any question about it. I mean, this is what every C-level has always wished for and never had. And we within the KM space are actually enabling this for some of the largest and most complex organizations on the planet now. Pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah. It's so exciting. I mean, AI is truly transformative. I was talking to someone a scientific researcher, about how he's using knowledge in AI, right? And, in the pharma industry, like for every drug on the market, there are like 5,000 to 10,000 ideas that fail. Failure rate is huge. By the time something makes it through to clinical trial, companies have typically invested billions. And then only 1 in 10 of those will actually succeed and get approved. So there's how do we change that, turn that paradigm upside down, right? To have, for example, generative AI research assistant and thought partner that can take a huge list of hundreds of potential biological targets, narrow them down based on genetic characteristics, co-design new experiments. The researcher said, this is giving me, it's not just productivity, right? Is giving me the freedom to innovate, to think outside the box, because to explore avenues I would have never even looked at this because it would have taken me weeks. Now I can do it in an afternoon. And that's just that's not even looking at things like protein folding, right? That are becoming hugely transformative. And so what you said before about we talked about this at the KM Summit, how these things are becoming viable, things that were science fiction. Right. So I just read that NASA is building an AI doctor for deep space missions. And you think science fiction, okay, Empire Strikes Back, the droid giving Luke Skywalker a new hand. or, data from the next Star Trek Next Generation, or like HAL 9000 from the Space Odyssey. A bit pessimistic, but then we talked about Interstellar, right? And TARS, right? Which is more optimistic view, but like all these things that just a few years ago we'd think, oh yeah, that's totally science fiction, not even close. Now all of a sudden it's like, holy cow, wait, I could see that being totally doable and practical. So, bring it back to our world. I think there's just so much potential for transforming the way companies operate, including especially pharma and the medical science and health industries, and then back to like transforming the way we learn and to help us achieve our most important objectives.
And with all of that, we've moved well beyond just competitive advantage. Now we're talking about saving lives, transforming lives by being able to get the right drug to market faster and better and more efficiently. That's pretty powerful stuff. I know we're running short on time, but I want our listeners to hear your KM journey, your story before we go. And I think it's particularly noteworthy that you had AI in your title way back in, I want to say like 2017 or 2018. So you are somebody who's been living this field for a lot longer than the current AI buzz and revolution. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the field of knowledge management, how you've evolved your own thinking during that time, maybe with an eye towards the person who's listening to this right now saying, man, I want to be TJ Hsu when I grow up.
I don't know if anyone's thinking that, but maybe they envy my large bushy eyebrows, and so
this is just audio,
yeah,
so they're just going to have to imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. So I started in knowledge management. I joined Accenture out of college, and I was there for about 20 years. The first project I was like a taxonomy information architecture project, and my boss was like, "Hey, you're pretty good at this. Why don't you think about joining our knowledge management practice?" And so there I got to spend 10 years doing knowledge management in like a dozen industries, working on all sorts of different projects from strategy to metrics to information architecture, content management, got to work with some really cool clients. And so I got to see knowledge management in many different forms at many different levels of maturity. Then I joined Accenture's internal knowledge management function for 10 years. And that was really cool because it was a mature function. Our technology organization was highly capable, kind of at the forefront, one of the earlier adopters of agile development. I think when I was there, we were on back in 2017, we're in agile sprint number 300 and something. Right? We've been doing it for a long time. And so there's a really strong capability there. And I found kind of my niche in or not my niche, but one of my sweet spots is around the whole digital component, right? The human-centered design, thinking about the end user thoughtfully, translating problems into intuitive digital knowledge solutions. Understanding the business, understanding the capabilities, kind of that bridge between technology and the business. And so, yeah, in 2017, 2018, that's when things like NLP engines started to become viable, right? And so we did a lot of work taking some of those early NLP engines to say, hey, can it ingest content and identify the concepts that are most relevant to that content? And back in 2017, I was like, holy cow, this is actually pretty good. And if we can use the AI to understand a piece of content, we can understand the knowledge we have. We can understand the content associated with the person, so we can understand the people we have. And then, so that's the expertise builder, right? You got the audio tagger on the knowledge side, the expertise builder on the people side. And then, if we know those things, we can connect the two. Connect the knowledge that's most relevant to this person, and that's the recommendation engine piece. So that was really interesting work, very difficult, but really satisfying to build those things. And a lot of those same concepts about what it takes to be successful building AI, a lot of those things haven't changed, even though the technology has gotten so much better. From there, I went to industry. So I went to oil and gas and then pharma, leading knowledge functions. And then now I was fortunate enough to land here at Amgen. So I think, for those who are in the field or looking to be in the field, I would say, try to be relevant, as we mentioned, right? If there's one thing you want to try and strive for in knowledge management is to be relevant, because that's one of the hardest things to do in our field. And just be curious, right? I think with AI, it's so interesting. Be curious about how this is changing knowledge and learning. You experiment with it, use it, learn about it, read up on it. I think just kind of having that curious mindset and constantly learning and applying sort of that critical thinking. One of the people at the summit, Dr. Bonnie Chuk at AstraZeneca, right? She was like, we are all leaders now, right? Every team member, no matter who you are, has been promoted to leader because now you have basically a limitless army of educated interns or college graduates who have a whole host of skills, right? And the role of the leader, though, hasn't changed. The role of the leader is to set the vision and the objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? To put in guardrails, right? Set the context, set the rules of the quote game, to identify risks, to validate the outputs, basically to be orchestrators, to be critical thinkers about how we apply knowledge and how we apply AI. And so that's what leaders have always done, right? So I think I thought that was really insightful from her.
I like that a lot. It's striking how much we are at this exciting point of inflection, and there's such opportunity in it, but also such responsibility. And I feel like you and I could spend another hour. I'm going to have you back on, TJ, to talk about how we get this right, how we really seize this moment and do it really well. But for now, TJ, I will thank you. And first and foremost, I just want to say, I love your enthusiasm around this. I mean, obviously your experience and your intellect, but man, I just get excited speaking with you about this because you are so positive and have such great energy around it. I imagine you inspire your team and your colleagues in the same way. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking with you, chatting with you. You have so much insight from where you sit, right? Leading the world's largest CAM consultancy. I love chatting about sci-fi and interstellar and androids. We should do this more often.
Yes, please. TJ Hsu, Director of R&D Knowledge Management at Amgen, truly one of the leaders in KM and AI right now. Thank you for your time and have a great day. And to our listeners, thanks for joining this episode of Knowledge Cast, and check out more at enterprise-knowledge.com. Have a great day, y'all.